It's Monday, the 31st of March, and this is session number 1, where we're considering 3 topics on the district-wide matters of the plan: contaminated land, hazardous substances, and natural hazards. My name's David McMahon, and before we proceed any further, I'm going to ask everyone to be upstanding, and we'll take the karakia tamatanga, led by Kiriana.
Led by all of us. Okay. Mai te pai maunga, raro ki te tai, mai te aotanga, raro ki te awaraki, tēnei te hapuri awhia, mai i tanatahi, whano, harama te toki, haumi, tai.
Thank you, everyone. As I said, my name's David McMahon. I'm the independent chair of the hearings panel. We have a truncated panel this morning dealing with this topic, and I'll just ask my fellow commissioners to introduce themselves, starting with
Brian Jefferson, representing South Wairarapa.
Craig Bowyer, Marsden District Council.
Brian Della, Carlton District Council.
Kia ora koutou katoa, independent commissioner, but representing Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa.
Thank you, everybody. And just to keep the ball rolling, we'll move to the officers, starting with you, Bronte.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Bronte Lincoln. I work for Bottomless School and I'm the council officer for the Natural Hazards chapter on behalf of council.
Kia ora koutou. Nicola Litchfield, tōka ingoa. I'm an expert in ag defaulting.
Thank you. And
Ruth McEwen, hearings administrator.
thank you, Ruth. Thanks for keeping things ticking along. Start with the back row.
Kia ora, Solitaire Robertson, Planning and Regulatory Manager, Carterton District Council.
Thanks, Solitaire.
Kia ora, Becky Adams, Planner at Carterton District Council.
Thank you.
Morena, Charles Farrell, I'm a planner at Bottomless School, and I'll be capturing the questions today.
Thank you, Charles. And you'll be deputising for Hamish Wesney, who I understand is in the UK at the moment. Yes, we'll hear from you later this morning, Alice.
Kia ora, Russell Dairy Group, Manager of Planning and Regulatory, South Wairarapa.
Thanks, Russell.
Amelia Lukens, South Wairarapa District Council Lead Building Officer, to answer questions.
Amelia, how do you spell your surname?
WKINS.
Okay. And you're the South Wairarapa District Council Building Consents Officer? Lead. Building Consents Lead. Thank you. And gentleman to my left.
Oh, Andy Duncan, I'm a submitter.
Yes, you are. You'll be on, you're the first submitter after lunch, Andy. Thanks for sitting in. And on Teams, we have Mr. Brown.
Kia ora, I'm Andy Brown from Greater Wellington Regional Council, Knowledge Risk Management Resilience Lead, SME for flood risk management.
Thanks, Andy. We'll come to you later. You haven't prepared a written brief as such, have you? No, but you're available for any questions that the panel might have regarding the flood hazard extents.
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. So I should also acknowledge Commissioner Plummer in the back row. Commissioner Plummer is not part of this panel, but is decided to sit in out of interest. Thank you, Alistair. Any procedural matters arising, Ruth? Okay. In that case, we're going to break at 10 a.m. for morning tea, just depending on where we're at in the scheme of things. And we're hoping to have our lunch break at 12 o'clock, and then we'll reconvene after lunch. This will be a little bit fluid, but I imagine the report from Bronte Lincoln will dominate the morning proceedings, less so for the contaminated land and hazardous substances, which is no reflection on your importance, Alice. Just that the majority of submissions are on the natural hazards topic. Okay, panel, anything before we proceed? Okay, well, Bronte, we'll ask you to take us through the 42A, and I understand you produced a summary statement which was posted on the web at the end of last week. Where during your present, I've had the luxury of reading your summary statement over the weekend, and there's certain factual matters that I'll ask you to focus on as you go through that, particularly some factual information about what the operative plan's approach is, what the focus of the district plan review was, and how the proposed plan has dealt with the different hazard elements. So essentially that's your paragraphs 4 and 5 for the operative plan, paragraph 6 for the district plan, and paragraph 7 of your summary statement for the proposed plan, and they equate sections 5.1, 5.2 and 5.3 of your 42A. Okay, the panel is conscious, Bronte, also that you've inherited this topic more recently, and you weren't involved in the production of the Section 32 reports or the draft provisions, but it's obvious to the panel that you've come up to speed very quickly with the topic, and your 42A is an illustration of that. So thank you for that. I'll leave you to take us through your summary statement.
So I prepared the Section 42A report for the matters relating to the natural hazards topic, and my qualifications and experience are set out in that report. The summary will cover a brief overview of the natural hazards topic, matters raised in submissions on the natural hazards topic, recommended amendments in response to those submissions, responses to pre-circulated expert evidence, and a summary of the key matters in contention for this topic. So the operative district plan, it does contain a natural hazards chapter, and it recognised the following hazards: flooding and river erosion, earthquakes, fault rupture, coastal erosion, inundation for storm surges and tsunami, and hill country erosion, slip, slumps and runoff. There was one objective which was implemented through a mix of regulatory and information-only approaches in that operative district plan.
I think that's an appropriate time to take us to section 5.1 of your 42A. And what the panel would like to understand here is what the key flooding elements are, the key hazard elements are, and how they were dealt with in a regulatory or non-regulatory manner. So if you could just take us through those key elements and you have to say.
So I've highlighted those 4 hazard areas, and then there were maps for flood hazard areas, flood alert areas, fault line hazard areas, erosion hazard areas, and foreshore protection areas. And there are corresponding rules for those. For fault hazard areas, there were rules regarding new structures containing if it had a habitable room or not, and that dictated whether consent was required. It also had rules for additions and alterations to habitable rooms in fault areas. In flood hazard areas, there was also permitted rules where it was a very small structure, non-habitable structure under 4 metres, for example, and 15 square metres was permitted. Everything else required consent. The earthworks approach was less than 20 square metres, cubic metres of earthworks in a flood hazard or erosion hazard area was permitted, otherwise needed consent. And additions and alterations as well to an existing building for habitable use in a flood hazard or erosion hazard area required consent as a restricted discretionary activity. And any erection, placement or conversion of a building for habitable use in a flood hazard area or erosion hazard area was a discretionary activity.
Okay. let's just recap there, starting with the fault hazard areas. They are mapped in the operative plan.
Yes,
Are they mapped in a as an overlay or as a fault line for setbacks? How is that information presented?
I would need to check and I can bring it up.
Well, okay, we don't need to take the time now, but perhaps make a note of that.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to understand is whether the operative plan, whether a landowner could have gone to the operative plan and determined readily whether their property was affected by the fault line hazard area.
Yes, I believe they could have.
Okay, but whether that method was a centre line approach with a nominated setback either side of it, or whether it was actually a map spatial extent.
Yeah.
That's the question.
Okay.
Okay.
I think it's his own. I don't think it's all.
And I think we need to be careful when we're using terms between the operative plan and the proposed plan, particularly the terms area and overlay. There's a risk of using them intertwined when that might not always be the case. Okay, well, be it as it may, however it's identified in the plan, the focus was largely on dwellings or buildings that have a habitable component, and fully discretionary activity was the status for that, with appropriate policy, presumably. Okay. Moving on to the flood hazard or the erosion hazard risks. Again, is presumably that's mapped as an overlay in the operative plan.
Yes, erosion hazard area.
Yeah. And okay. And there's a small amount of permitted activities on habitable structures, earthworks, but most activities default to restricted discretionary activity, or for habitable buildings, a discretionary activity.
Yes.
Okay. And then the final hazard that's in the operative plan is the flood alert areas. Again, presumably they are mapped.
Yes.
Their spatial extents shown on the plan.
Yep.
But there are no rules to implement those in the operative plan.
That is my understanding.
Okay.
Yep.
It would be, what I'm going to ask you to do at the end, as part of your writer reply, is to capture this in a table which shows all the flood elements, perhaps in a central column, and then the type of control that's in the operative plan, both in terms of mapping and control. And then in the right-hand column, the same for the proposed plan. That would be a useless. It'll be a useful resource for the panel when it comes to deliberations. Okay, that's the operative plan panel. Is there any questions on that? We've got three key elements of hazard, with two of them matched by mapping. Three of them all matched by mapping, but excuse me, only two of them matched by rules. The third one, an information layer.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I want to take us back to the district plan review and what that found about the workability and issues associated with that.
Yep. So the review of the natural hazards chapter identified that there is new mapping available for flooding, faults and liquefaction, which should be included in the proposed district plan.
It's faults, flooding and liquefaction.
Yep. And this should be included in the plan along with a policy and rule framework that aligns with best practice and national guidance documents. So adopting a risk-based approach rather than the approach of the district plan.
Yes. Okay. And on those three elements, what was the source of information that provided that new detail? So starting with flooding.
So flooding. The flood hazard mapping data was provided by Greater Wellington Regional Council in March 2023.
Yes.
Yep. For fault mapping, the active fault mapping, a special report for the combined councils was provided by GNS Science in October 2022.
Yes.
And for liquefaction, the Wairarapa District's liquefaction vulnerability assessment by Tongan Taylor in November 22.
November 2022. Thank you. Okay, and how did that then all translate into the proposed district plan?
So adopting those three hazards, the flooding, faults and liquefaction, a risk-based approach was taken where activities are categorised into hazard sensitive, potentially hazard sensitive and less hazard sensitive, and the hazards are categorised into low, moderate and high categories.
Yes.
And the rule framework corresponds to whether you are in the type of activity you are, your sensitivity, and the low, moderate or high hazard risk.
That's your table on page 2. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, so as a general rule, if you're in a low hazard area and you're a less hazard sensitive activity, there's a permitted activity regime.
Yes.
As the hazard increases and the sensitivity increases, so do the level of control.
Correct.
Okay. Okay. And I'm just looking at the table. The most stringent control is non-complying activity.
Yes.
In the river corridor 4, which is a high hazard area and hazard sensitive activity. So that's 3 + 3 equals non-complying activity.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. And there are risks, there are policies and rules reflecting those combination of risks and sensitivities.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I want to take us through the river, so the flood river flood hazard categories.
The flood hazard categories. Yes.
Three types.
Yes. So the highest high hazard area, the flood hazard type is the river corridor. In a moderate hazard area, the flood hazard type is an overland flow path. Low hazard area, the flood hazard type is ponding, so ponding area.
Okay. High, medium, low, river corridor, overland flow path and ponding. Okay. Are there similar categorizations for fault and liquefaction?
Yes, so as part of my recommendations in the Section 42 report, I recommended that the fault hazards were reintroduced into this high, moderate and low risk-based approach in the notified version of the proposed district plan. They were a separate standalone rule.
Okay.
I recommend it as a response to submissions. I recommend putting them back in. So there's a high hazard area, fault hazard, a moderate and a low. And the difference between them is determined by the recurrence interval. Yes. And the complexity of the fault.
Okay. And are those, how does a user of the plan know whether they're in high, moderate or low? Does the mapping indicate that, or is that a calculation that needs to be undertaken?
The mapping indicates that. So there's red, orange and yellow areas reflect the high, moderate and low faults.
Okay.
Similar for flooding, I think it's blue, dark blue, light blue, lighter blue.
Okay. Dark, medium. Thank you. And Finally, liquefaction. What's the,
So for liquefaction, it's only categorised as a low hazard for possible liquefaction prone areas.
yes,
Yes, out of the Tonkin and Taylor report, they categorised it into 3 categories, and only the possible liquefaction prone areas adopted for the district plan.
okay, so those categories, I think you've carried paragraph 87 panel. Categories being liquefaction category is undetermined, liquefaction damage is unlikely, or liquefaction damage is possible. And so it's just the last category that has some policies and rules associated with it.
Yes.
Okay. And it would fit into the matrix of low hazard.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So that's fault, flooding and liquefaction. Are there any other hazard?
Yes, so there's the flood alert area in the notified version of the proposed district plan, which I recommend to be changed to flood vulnerability area.
Yes.
Sponsor submissions. That sits outside the risk-based approach method. It's not a high, moderate or low category because the way the mapping was done, I guess, it's at a different standard to the other flood mapping. So it's less certainty about that flood vulnerability area. It has a separate rule. And that's how properties in that area dealt with.
And that's rule 7, is it? What version at least? Yeah, rule 7 recommended to be rule 6. Any new potentially hazard sensitive. Okay. Sensitive active bonding. There's a potential confusion, right? But maybe if we're talking about rules, talk about the notified number first, and then if it's changed. Yeah. Yep. And I think it's policy 12 that sets up the basis for it. Yes. Okay. So there's been, can you just, to the extent that you're able to, and it may well be that this is something for Dr. Litchfield, but can you just take us through, I don't know, Dr. Litchfield, Mr. Brown, just take us through the data information, particularly the flood hazard extent mapping versus the REM maps, and which is, I understand, is the basis between flood hazard areas and flood alert / vulnerability areas. Yeah. So there's a difference in accuracy of flood maps between the northern and the southern Wairarapa, and so the policy response addresses that. The different maps available include the more accurate flood hazard extent, which is in the north, and the more granular regional exposure model REM maps, which are in the south. Yes. And the risk-based approach method and provisions are more appropriate for the flood hazard extent, so the maps in the north, but a more bespoke approach is necessary for the REM maps due to their potential uncertainty associated with them. It's my understanding, and Mr. Brown could speak to this further, but the Greater Wellington Regional Council are currently undertaking consultation to update that flood mapping, which is not so certain, and it's currently happening, and more accurate mapping is due to be released in May this year. Okay. Mr. Brown, that's probably a nice segue for you. I understand you were the lead author on the hazard data that was received 2023, I think it was. Yes, March 2023. I know the panel put a lot of pressure on Greater Wellington to deliver that in time, and you did that, so thank you for that. We did express our appreciation up the line for that work, so hopefully that reached you. Is there anything you want to add to that very sort of rough understanding that I've outlined, and which Ms. Linkhorn's backed me up on in terms of the flood hazard data and the two sorts of mapping that have resulted?
Yeah, so we do have those, say, two sorts of mapping. Obviously, the regional mapping, which at the moment covers those areas outside of essentially the main urban centres. So Masterton, Greytown and Carterton all have detailed modelling to the new flood hazard modelling standards, so which goes through quite a lengthy technical and consultation process with the community. And absolutely right, we have just finished the calibration consultation in Featherstone, so tracking towards having the mapping updated for the Featherstone area in May as well, ready for this as well. So that'll be an update to the regional modelling, which is done in a much more sort of region-wide approach. And again, doesn't have the same level of data and information into those modelling outputs.
Yes. Ms. Lincoln's referred to a sort of a northern southern split in terms of the mapping. Can you just take us through that in terms of a catchment type answer?
Yeah, it's really been how our modelling program has been structured. So I understand that flood hazard modelling is quite a lengthy and resource intensive process. So we have been working on those higher risk areas, particularly in Masterton, and then working our way down the valley. The areas that we've yet to provide that detailed modelling for, obviously the lower Wallalapa Valley, so essentially Greytown down, Featherstone being the next key one. But then it sort of turns into the rural component for the valley, where there's less sort of large-scale communities at risk, which is why that program is sequenced in that way. So that regional modelling, our mapping does exist for the lower valley, and it's just that sequence that we've been working through. So in place for communities, Carterton, the top of South Wallalapa and Masterton, and it's just further down that we are working on.
Yes, and then where the detailed mapping has occurred around the Greytown, Masterton and Carterton, presumably it also includes the rural extents surrounding those townships.
Yeah, so essentially the floodplains of the major rivers that affect those communities.
Yes. Okay. And what's the main river catchment and floodplain in the south that would contribute to flooding?
So the primary river catchment down there is the Lower Mahunga system, where we do have a series of formed spillways around Lake Wallalapa. And there are a number of smaller tributaries that come in and sort of dotted throughout the lower valley, but it is primarily the Lower Mahunga system.
Okay. Mr. Brown, we're lay people here, so I wondered if you could just explain how the flood hazard data was collected for both the flood hazard extents and the REM data, in terms of the approach that was adopted and the shape of the information.
So the detailed flood hazard mapping, which form those flood hazard extents, essentially now take quite a systematic process through our flood hazard modelling standard. So in terms of data, we look at all of our flow gauge record, rainfall data for those areas. We look at NIWA data and what's available from a weather perspective. We then use the latest LiDAR that's available at the time with targeted survey to fill in any of those gaps, so to get the accurate topography of the ground. We also, as we're developing that process, there's two key components. There's a hydrological component where we do the hydrological modelling, and then there's the hydraulic component. The hydrology essentially takes that rainfall and weather patterns into account, and then the hydraulics is essentially building the river channel in the computer models, and then bringing the two together essentially is putting that flow through the model. We also, through the process, seek to take into account any historic information. So from the communities, working with Mana Whenua where possible to get any of the historic information, essentially observed flood events, which we use to calibrate our models, before we then produce the design flows, which gives us a really good sense of, are the models performing as they should, and are we reflecting what the community expects? So the detailed modelling, say for Masterton, Carterton, Greytown, and now Featherstone are going through that process. And then that's brought together with two stages of peer review on the hydraulics, one stage on the hydrology, and then a final independent audit, which essentially checks the entire process and that we've taken into account the community's input into the process. So that's for the detailed modelling. The regional modelling is a little bit different. Essentially, it picks up areas where we don't have a lot of gauged records. So that's essentially, we don't have rain gauges, we don't have a flow data, and we don't have that information, essentially that historic backlog to build up our records. So it uses a lot of the newer products that are available, essentially to give us an approximate version of the weather information, and then uses the latest LiDAR available at the time, and essentially just does a rain on grid method, essentially just putting rainfall on the landscape and seeing where it floods. We have, with that regional model, seen it calibrate really well in recent flood events. So people remember 2 or 3 winters ago, it was a very wet winter, and certainly in the rural areas, we saw good calibration through that regional model. And in those areas outside of those gauge catchments, it is going to be the best available information that we've got and are likely to have for many years to come. Essentially, we just don't have the rain gauges in those areas. And we also saw it perform pretty well in Cyclone Gabriel, and obviously the communities around Tinui and Foliama catchments, which were affected. We saw good calibration, which gives us good confidence in that regional model. It's a good approximation of flood hazard in those essentially areas outside of the gauge detailed catchment areas that we've got.
Yes. In scientific terms, the phrase level of confidence obviously pops up a lot. In very generic terms, what sort of level of confidence, what's the difference level of confidence in the information between the flood hazard extents and the REM mapping?
Given the process that we've gone through on the detailed flood extents, with high confidence in those, given the lengthy process and the checks and balances through that process. The RM modelling would be a medium confidence and be reasonably good, considering we've seen it calibrate, particularly in the rural areas. For the urban areas, certainly the flood extents we have a lot more confidence in, and it's those rural areas that the RM modelling has performed well. So moderate confidence on those.
Okay. What's the process for converting the REM modelling for the southern catchments to flood hazard extents? What do you actually need to do?
So what we aren't trying to convert the RM modelling into detailed modelling. We're essentially building detailed models through our flood hazard modelling process. So that process I described with the community engagement, hydraulics, data capture, we're essentially running through a full end-to-end process. We're currently in that for Featherstone and the Lower Valley modelling. So the rural modelling for the wider Lower Valley is happening. It's just on a slightly slower time frame, so a little bit further behind. But the hydraulics essentially is being worked on at the moment, so it's working through its process. But essentially, it's a new model builds for those areas.
Okay. And for Featherstone, in a month's time, what about for other townships and rural areas currently in the REM category? What's the time frame for that?
So those other models, I would expect them to be 2 to 3 years away.
Okay. Well, that's all I have on Brown. Any questions of Andy? Okay. Thank you, Andy. Welcome to stick around. We may have some other questions. Come back to you, Bronte. Is there anything you want to clarify that came out of that questioning with Mr. Brown? No. Okay. One of the things that, in addition to the table I described earlier that we're asking you to prepare, one of the other things I think will be useful is a reworked table 1 in your summary, which is the matrix, if we can call it that, with the hazard areas along the top and the activities in terms of the sensitivity along the vertical. It would be useful if you could tag those terms and the cells with the policy and rule references. So, for example, I started doing it last night, and for low hazard areas, I know, well, I think I'm right, policy 5 deals with that. Moderate hazard areas is policy 8, as is high hazard. Less hazard sensitive activities is policy 4, and maybe policy 5. and the rules on less sensitive rule 2. So that's a sort of a starter for 10, if you like, but I've marked it up. I don't know how you're going to present it. Probably in a landscape version would be useful. In addition to knowing what the policy numbers and rule numbers are, we'd like to know what the active words are in those policies, like avoid, manage, and where the focus is on habitable, non-habitable. Yeah, so just take your time as part of your right of reply in presenting that. But again, that will be a very useful tool for the panel and their deliberations. Any questions on that?
No, I think I understand. Yeah.
I note that the last, well, in addition to the 3 types of activities, last 2 rows in that table on page 2 specifically single out additions to buildings and earthworks. And I just wondered, and Mr. Brown might be able to assist here, presumably the earthworks in the flood hazard areas is less about risk, but about potential for deflection onto neighbouring properties. Mr. Brown, is that too simplistic? Is it more than just deflection for wanting to control earthworks in flood hazard areas?
Yeah, from my perspective, it is essentially the impact on those flow routes, and you're right, the deflection of flow and the movement of water onto neighbouring properties, and just being careful to manage the impacts of those. Okay,
right. Because earthworks in themselves don't have a sensitivity, do they? Unlike buildings.
No. Obviously, the main sensitivity for us is essentially the location of particularly residential properties and areas within those flood hazard zones. But yeah, earthworks themselves just impact essentially the flow of water.
Okay.
Yes. Just Mr. Brown, could I just ask you a question going back a bit regarding the mapping of the South Wairarapa floodplain area? How much involvement are the local farmers and landowners? I mean, you talked earlier on about you haven't got rain gauges in areas. I mean, every farmer's got a rain gauge. So, how much are you using their data?
Yeah, so that's really through that community engagement that we put in. We do it right at the start. And then as we go through the data capture component, so if anything, and there's any records or any information, any observations that landowners do have, then yeah, anything and everything we capture and collect, and we'll take that into account through the modelling process. Just adds a lot of richness to the product and gives us something that we can all sort of have confidence in, and just builds that confidence level in the modelling.
Just on that, just to give the panel some confidence on that, are you aware where there has been direct engagement with the rural community and farmers and the utilisation of their on-farm data?
I am not yet for the wider rural modelling, but I know that process is in its very early stages. And I know we have been talking to Mana Whenua, the steering group around Lake Wailarapa, and through the scheme committee. But it's something I could take back to the team and make sure that they are taking into account as they work through that process.
Yes, I think there's 2 questions there. What's happened? What was the level of consultation with the rural community, particularly the farming community, as part of the flood alert REM delineation in the proposed plan, and what's proposed as we move towards more detailed hazard mapping for the southern catchments?
So on the RM mapping, we haven't done widespread community consultation. So we've had anecdotal engagement with landowners following the weather events that we saw 2 or 3 years ago, who have been looking at it on the web, and it has been published, and we've worked through it with the local authorities. So the specialists at the local authorities and the local area engineers and experts rather than the wider community.
Yes. Okay.
Can I just add a comment? I think this quite a valid point is being brought up here, where there will be some farms that are generational that could have records going back over 100 years as to rainfall, and so we can't can't underestimate some of the importance of these rainfall records here. Yeah. Just a comment, yeah.
I just think adding to that, a few years ago when flood mapping was done in Greytown, there was a lot of the locals did make you go back and have a look at it. I mean, and using all their data, as Craig just mentioned, that went back a long, long time, you actually came to a point where their knowledge was as important as your information.
Okay. Anything else, panel? Thank you, Mr. Brown. Back to you, John Peake. I think we're, as long as you're happy with those two elements of homework that we've said, Hugh, we can move to paragraph section 3 of your summary.
Sure.
And you've spent a lot of time, we've spent a lot of time on this background, but I think and well worth understanding the framework before we delve into the submissions that are in relation to it.
So there were a total of 40 original submissions and 14 further submissions, lots of submission points, received for the natural hazards topic. Submitters generally agreed with the risk-based approach to natural hazards. Some submitters thought that the categories of either activities or hazard types were amended, and submitters also challenged the use of hazard mapping if they considered it wasn't robust or truly reflected the hazard at their property. In regards to pre-circulated expert evidence, I've read that listed at part 4.9 from the submitters, and I'll respond to this evidence below. There's both support and opposition made in that submitters evidence.
It's noted that you hadn't listed the evidence of Ms. Rosser from EnviroNZ. Had you not had an opportunity to do that?
I did, and I thought that was as on a different topic.
Okay.
Am I right, Alice Balloon? That was your submitter?
Okay, so that's hazardous substances and contamination. Okay. Okay. Look, just before we take us through the key issues, starting with issue 1, I think we should actually hear from Dr. Litchfield, just in the same way that we heard from Mr. Brown in terms of the approach that GNS undertook in relation to the fault hazard mapping. Can you give us a thumbnail sketch of your involvement, GNS's involvement, and how that has resulted in the mapped extents within the proposed plan?
Sure. So I led that study. It was a team of us. It was 3 of us working on it, and we all mapped different faults. It was a desktop study. We did a couple of days of field work of checking our mapping, but most of it was done in the office using LiDAR data. So the faults hadn't been mapped using LiDAR data before, and as we expected, when we did that mapping, it found a lot more fault traces. So that traces.
You say it hadn't or had?
Sorry.
Previously, the mapping had or hadn't used?
Hadn't used LiDAR in the Wairarapa.
Yes.
In other areas of Clinton and elsewhere. But as we expected, we found a lot more what we call traces. So that's the individual lines. So we knew that was going to happen. And we prioritised the mapping because the Wairarapa is so large an area and has a lot of faults. We prioritised areas around the towns particularly, and probably did in general more mapping in the Wairarapa Valley than in the hills. In the hills, we just looked at the previously mapped faults. So for each fault, we mapped those lines that we could see in the data, and then we built our zones around them. We did 2 types of zones. We did what we call fault avoidance zones for those high priority areas. So they follow the MFE Act default guidelines that published in 2003. That's the process outlined in that. It's a risk-based process. In the other areas, which were generally away from the towns and the hills, or some of the lesser active faults, we developed what we called fault awareness areas.
So the FAZs and the FAAs? Yes,
acronyms, I'm afraid, yeah. So it's the FAZs that have been picked up in the proposed district plan and turned into the hazard areas.
Yes.
So in that report, we followed the MFE Act default guidelines and the Environment Canterbury guidelines for the FAAs and made recommendations about how to classify them. And they were modified for the draft district plan and the proposed district plan.
Yes. What extent did you take into account the existing mapping of fault?
We started with the existing mapping. We started whatever we could find. We did ask councils for existing mapping data and reports. We weren't supplied any, so it was basically what we had at GNS or were aware of.
Yes.
So yes, we looked. We started with the existing mapping, and as I said, we remapped all the existing faults, and then prioritised looking around the towns and in the Wairarapa Valley to look for any more that we had previously recognised.
I'm renowned for asking silly questions, but presumably none of the existing faults had disappeared.
There was one or two in the hills that we thought, weren't obvious.
Okay,
so,
but the LiDAR data picked up more what you call traces.
Traces, generally found, and in some cases we found more faults. So we each little line is a trace, and then we decide that if there's a bunch of them that extend for several kilometres, that they're likely to be a fault.
Yes,
call a fault that's going to rupture in a future earthquake.
Yes, and what science are you relying on in terms of that approach?
What science?
Yes, what's take us? I mean, I'm a Christchurch earthquake refugee.
Right.
I moved up to Wellington 3 days after the Christchurch earthquake.
Right.
And the clothes I went to work in on the day of the earthquake. So, and I was lucky enough to do some work for the government on mapping of, not the mapping, but the zoning underpinning the areas of high liquefaction and high lateral spread in the eastern suburbs of Christchurch. So I have a little bit of an understanding of the science, but working with Dr. Jean Kupek from Oricon in that space. But I just wondered, what, for the panel's benefit, when you're looking at it LiDAR data, what are you seeing when you come across a trace?
Okay, so generally faults are straighter features than other landform features, like the one that's probably commonly you can't decide between them is if it's a river, like a river, but former riverbank, but generally they are quite sort of curvy and scalloped and so on. So we're looking for something that really cuts across different features of different ages in particular. That again tells you that it's a rupture that's happened more recently across all of those. So we're looking for straight features. We're looking for changes in geology on either side that would tell you that it's a fault. It's mainly that cutting surfaces of different ages is an absolute key one for us.
Is there how much room is there for interpretation, and when one's analysing LiDAR data to ascertain whether it is a active fault or a potential fault, or is it likely to rupture or not?
There certainly is. Because these faults have ruptured hundreds to thousands of years ago, they get modified over time. They're a bit harder to see after time. So there is a level of interpretation in them. In general, what we have mapped in the report and that study was, if we on balance of evidence think that it's a fault, it's in there. If we didn't think it was a fault, we didn't map it.
Yes.
So it's sort of like over 50% confident of all the lines in there, but some of them we are more confident than others because they're straighter and clearer in the landscape, and other places they're not.
Is that the basis for identifying whether it's a fault, or the basis for identifying whether it fits into the FAZ or the FAA? What?
No, the decision to make FAZs or FAAs was a choice we made at the start of the project for certain faults in certain areas. So we could have done FAZs for all of the faults. It's just that it was going to cost too much and take too long.
Okay.
Basically.
So for the panel's benefit, what's the essential difference between an FAZ and an FAA, risk-based approach?
From a risk-based approach, the FAZs have been done more carefully,
Identified more carefully.
Identified more carefully. We define how wide the fault zone is, and then we add the 20-metre buffer on them. The FAAs is just like we've mapped some faults here, and we just put a 150-metre buffer either side or a zone around it that's equal width everywhere. So it's basically the FAAs are kind of like flagging. There's a fault mapped here, but we need to do more work on it.
Yes.
And so in my recommendations, I recommended that we do the high, moderate, low classification for both FAZs and FAAs, but have a more permissive set for the FAAs.
Yeah, I'm just struggling to understand how a trace or a fault gets allocated into FAZ or FAA, regardless of what the buffer is, etc. What's that first decision point to decide? Is it its location? Its proximity?
It was proximity to towns. It was the most active faults we did FAZs for.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's kind of the higher risk faults.
Yes, but that's not to say that the FAAs might actually become FAZs if further work
was done. If someone wanted,
so there was a risk-based approach to the risk-based approach in the sense.
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
So the focus was on the areas of greater population, presumably, as you said, the valleys, not the hills.
No. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that's useful, Pam.
Yeah, just a question, and probably a clarification. There's a significant difference between the buffer sizes, 20 to 150 metres. That's just because of the level of accuracy. You're not quite so sure where that trace may be.
It's kind of a combination of two things. Faults do change along them. So we saw that even in the Kaikoura earthquakes. In some places, the Kikaringu fault, which is a really active fault, in some places was really narrow, and then other places it just really widened out, and then it gets narrow again. So faults just do that, and it's to do with the soils that they come through. Sometimes they're wide in certain kinds of soils, and other times they're really narrow. So it's that. But sometimes it's the uncertainty as well. Like if you can see it on either side of a river, but you can't see it in the active river plane, then you make it wide because you're just not quite sure exactly where it is. So it's kind of a combination of the two.
So if there was to be further evidence provided that that we were able to clearly delineate where it is, that you would be happy with that being reduced to 20 metres?
Yes, absolutely. And that's what we've done with a couple of a couple of reports done and done some trenching and showing there's no fault here. So we bring it in. That's exactly what we need to do. We've got site investigations, ground investigations.
Yeah. Right. Could I ask, when you started analysing the LiDAR data and putting it against what you knew, did anything come up that you unexpected?
We did find some new faults.
Yeah.
We kind of thought we might, but I was surprised how many there were. Yeah. Some of the faults changed a little bit, and I don't want to get too technical here, but the Wairarapa fault, for example, we thought was mainly a horizontal movement and quite straight traces, but we actually found these ones out the front that actually showed that it also comes up in different ways. So yeah, there was a few things.
Could you put a period of time on it? Like those new faults you found, were they recent or?
No, some of them have ruptured recently, some of them a long time ago. Yeah, we just found all sorts really.
Do you think that more modern technology will find things that we don't know about? Or do we have to wait for it to shake?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, different. It probably is more faults below the ground that we will find with other technologies. The LiDAR only tells you what's reached the surface. So like the Christchurch earthquake was faults other way under the ground. We wouldn't have found them using LiDAR. So
exactly.
Yeah, that's still good.
Can I just ask another question?
Yes.
Just to confirm my stupidity here, I think. How do you age a rupture? How do you age it? Yeah.
So it's the surface that it ruptures, goes across. So, for example, the Wairarapa fault, we see it rupturing all different age terraces along the Waihina River, for example, whereas other faults, we might only see it on the top one. That suggests that it's ruptured thousands and thousands of years ago, but not more.
Yep, now I get it. Yep. Just, this is a question I'm going to put to you, and I'm also going to put the same question to Mr. Brown in relation to flooding. And I promise it's my last question. What's been the spatial change in the operative plan dealt with a fault line hazard area. It didn't have the distinction between the FAZs and the FAAs. Is all of the fault line hazard area FAZ in the proposed plan? Or is it a mixture of FAZ and FAA?
FAZ's in the proposed plan.
Okay.
In terms of the operative plan just had, I think it was about 3 faults. They don't have a few faults, and they were really narrow.
Okay.
Just like 20 metres either side of a line, I think. So in general, I would say pretty much all our zones are wider than previous.
Yes, and so those 3 faults would have all be in the FAZ in the proposed plan now. They've been carried across. Yeah. So the addition and plus new faults.
Well, faults that just weren't mapped in the operative plan. They may have been known about, just hadn't been mapped. Yes.
How good is the LiDAR data?
It's very good. Yeah, it's the gold standard. And the Wellington region Wairarapa data, LiDAR data is great. It's 1 metre resolution. So it allows, what it's really good for is things like seeing through the trees, because the radar pulses can get through the trees, so you can remove all that, so you can see bare earth. Of course, it doesn't work if the ground's been modified. If the ground's modified, you can't see the traces anymore.
Is it like seeing maps in a stereoscopic type?
Not so much. I think of it as sort of turning the light on or putting your glasses on. You just really see the precision. You see it really, clearly focused. You see the detail.
Yes. Okay. So the spatial extent of the FAZ, which was the old fault hazard areas, is increased, and we've got these new fault avoidance areas spatially too. Thank you.
Yes.
Mr. Brown, just the same question to you in terms of flooding. We had flood hazard areas and flood alert areas in the operative plan, and we've got those again, albeit with some different terminology. The flood alerts now becoming flood vulnerability. What's the spatial change in those areas? And if you can't answer that now, is it something you could answer and provide information down the line?
Yes, I think that's a question I'll put to our advisory engineers, and I can answer that one in for you in time.
Yes, that would be good. And I'll invite, thank you, and I'll invite Mr. Litchfield to, Dr. Litchfield, to do the same if you can, in terms of the metrics associated with the area involved. Okay, it's just gone 10 o'clock. I know we're just on to issue number 1, Bronte, but I think we'll push on a little bit, get a bit more done before we break for tea. What I would encourage you to do is, for example, in key issue 1, I've had a look through that, where you're just noting support and there's nothing in contention. I think you can skip over that and go to the matters that are in contention.
Sure.
Let's just see how far we get, and we might break around 10:15.
Okay. So key issue 1 is the overall risk-based approach to managing natural hazards, and sort of covers things at the front end of the chapter as well. So definitions of hazard sensitive activities and the categorisation of hazards. Mr. Daw, on behalf of Greater Wellington Regional Council, the first issue, I guess, is he disagreed with the recommendation to include infrastructure as a less hazard sensitive activity, and the subsequent deletion of the rule associated with infrastructure and hazard areas. He says the checks and balances under the policy 4, activities in low hazard areas, and policy 11, the precautionary approach, will be lost. Maybe for context, what happened is the original submissions were made challenging that infrastructure wasn't defined in the hazard sensitive, potentially hazard sensitive, or less hazard sensitive. And as a default, I guess, they sort of fall into the less hazard sensitive because it wasn't otherwise defined as hazard or potentially hazardous, hazard sensitive. So I looked at that, and in my recommendation in my section 42A report, I suggested that that be clarified and be noted as a less hazard sensitive activity. And the reasons for this, I sort of repeat here that the definition of infrastructure is very broad. It includes a wide range of infrastructure sizes and types. And to require every size and type of infrastructure to obtain resource consent, if it was considered potentially hazard sensitive or hazard sensitive activity, would be very onerous. On balance, that I consider that it's appropriate that it is a less hazard sensitive activity, noting that whilst it's a less hazard sensitive activity in a moderate or high hazard area, it still requires consent, resource consent as a restricted different activity status, but in those hazard areas, moderate and high, you still need a consent, and then you can have a case-by-case assessment on that. So just because it's less hazard sensitive does not mean that you don't need consent for it in all hazard areas.
What I'm looking at your appendix 1 to your summary statement. What's the rule here? Is it R7?
Rule, well, in the introduction to the chapter, and I haven't made a change in this appendix 1 because it's as I recommended in my 42, is that
Okay, so go to your 42.
42. So in the introduction, infrastructure would be included under the definition of less hazard sensitive activities, which also includes accessory buildings and structures for non-habitable. I've added infrastructure.
I see.
Then parks.
It's on page 73 panel.
And then as a consequence, what that means is that the policies that apply to less hazard sensitive activities apply to infrastructure. I've kept the specific policy 8 for infrastructure in hazard areas to enable the operation, maintenance and upgrading of existing infrastructure and allow new infrastructure where it has an operational functional need. It can be designed to maintain its integrity and function, and it doesn't not increase the risk to properties.
Okay, so apart from the addition of the word repair, there's no difference between your 42A track changes and your summary statement track changes. Okay. Okay, so infrastructure in low risk areas is permitted, and in the moderate to high rule given.
So
Rule 6.
Rule 2, so less hazard sensitive activities, so infrastructure in all hazard areas. So they're permitted in a low hazard area and then restricted discretionary in a moderate or high.
Page 76 on your
Yes.
2A rule 2. Because infrastructure is defined as less hazard sensitive activities, that's captured.
Yes.
Rule 2, I see. And moderate to high, restricted discretion, understood. And so the equivalent rule, equivalent policy is 8, was it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And policy 5, because that deals with less hazard sensitive activities.
Do you think policy 5 and policy 8 talk to each other appropriately? I mean, talks about only allow new, policy 8 talks about only allow new infrastructure to be established in hazard areas, and it doesn't distinguish between the hazard area types where 3 matters are increased. Doesn't talk about the sensitivity or talk about the hazard risk.
You're right, it doesn't talk about it being a less hazard sensitive activity. But the allow new infrastructure aligns with policy 5, which is allow less hazard sensitive activities.
Okay, but have you changed it back to allow for, because it's enable in your 42A?
Oh, sorry. Yes, it's enable operation, maintenance and upgrading. So basically keep the same, allow what's there. And then the second part of that, and allow new infrastructure. So it's that allow new, which is the same as policy 5, allow less hazard sensitive activities.
Allow would be through a combination of permitted and for low risk and restricted discretionary for medium, moderate to high.
Yes.
Okay. Just reflect on that. In your right of reply, just to make sure that the answers that you've given are ones that you want to restate. I don't want you to give us an answer on the hop on this one.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll consider the wording.
Yes.
The status. Yeah.
Changes would have to be consequential.
Yeah.
That just brings me to a question about the submission from Greater Wellington on the infrastructure. Was there actually a submission or a further submission from Greater Wellington on this? Dr. Dawes' evidence doesn't reference a submission.
Yes, an original submission by, I can't recall, someone else queried the hazard categorization of infrastructure and Greater Wellington. Further submission on that. Yeah.
Could you reference that in your right of reply, please?
Yeah.
Both the original submission and the further submission. Okay. And then that takes us on to visitor accommodation. The same question, a submission from Greater Wellington, whether there's scope for the change that that you've recommended.
Yes, I will need to check that. From memory, I don't recall there being a submission from Greater Wellington challenging visitor accommodation specifically. There were a number of submissions on what constitutes hazard sensitive activities, but I'd need to check.
Okay. If you wouldn't mind, but assuming there is one, you're comfortable with the change?
I think, yeah, visitor accommodation is the right place and hazard sensitive.
Okay. We note the recommended agreement and change with Mr. Anderson for the telcos and the change to definition there, which is on page 73. And that's been updated in your summary statement, I think, to delete the reference to the NES.
Yes, correct.
Yes, that's good. Those changes are summarised on page 4 of the table. Okay, I think we will take the morning tea adjournment now, come back and deal with issue 2. I'm sure we can move through it much more quickly. So, well, look, we're only just going to take over 10 minutes, so we'll come back just after 25 past, so we can move on quickly. I'm happy for people to drink their tea or coffee at the tables.
Thank you.
Hearings